In our last few lectures, we've been looking very carefully at the basic Keynesian model. And I hope you've been able to appreciate just how powerful an analytical tool that is. Basic Keynesian model uses some very simple analytical concepts. It's a very abstract version of the economy, but nonetheless it provides a very powerful means of understanding the link between planned aggregate expenditure and the business cycle. Why it is that should there be a fall in planned aggregate expenditure, the economy would move to an equilibrium characterised by a negative output gap with actual real GDP being below potential. Why it might be that an expansionary output gap could emerge if for some reason planned aggregate expenditure increased and actual real GDP moved above its potential. It's an important model. It's an important model in the history of macroeconomics because it provided an intellectual foundation for government intervention in the macroeconomy, for the active management of planned aggregate expenditure, provided a means by which recessions could be fought, and it very much provided an impetus for governments to take much more responsibility for the management of the macroeconomy. But it is a very simple model, and in at least one respect, it's missing an important part of the macroeconomic story. The basic Keynesian model is a model of the very short run, of circumstances in which prices in the macroeconomy don't change, where all the adjustment occurs via changes to quantity. I'll ask you to think back to that analogy of the ice cream store that I used to introduce this topic. What that leaves out of the story is inflation. In the basic Keynesian model, we simply don't have the framework in which we can talk about issues relating to inflation because by definition, that is a framework in which prices don't change. So what I want to do now is to expand the analysis to include an explicit discussion of inflation. And we're going to need a different sort of analytical tool to analyse issues involving inflation. And we're going to be talking a lot about monetary policy as well, because monetary policy is a key component of the model that we're now about to construct. It's a model known as the aggregate demand inflation adjustment model, sometimes also known as the aggregate demand aggregate supply model. I tend to use those two terms interchangeably. It shares some common characteristics with the basic Keynesian approach, as you'll see, but it has a much richer sort of underlying structure, a structure that allows us to think about issues involving inflation, and in particular the link between monetary policy and inflation. And I think the easiest way to think about this model in relation to the basic Keynesian model is to think about it in terms of the time period in which each model is appropriate. Basic Keynesian model is a short-run model, a very short-run model. Think about it as applying to periods of, let's say, a year or less. The aggregate demand inflation adjustment model is a model of longer time periods. It's a model of, let's say, between 1 year and 2 years or even 3 years. So we're still not in a time period long enough for our growth economics analytical framework to be relevant, but it's a time period long enough so that prices can start adjusting to changes in the spending plans of the various sectors in the economy. So it's a model which enables us to say something about inflation. But first, let's just revisit our basic Keynesian model and show how monetary policy can be incorporated in that model. We've looked at this before. So here we have an economy that's settled into an equilibrium with a contractionary output gap. We spoke a lot about how fiscal policy can be used to counteract this situation. We also, of course, mentioned some of the difficulties with financing that fiscal policy. But monetary policy is an alternate policy that can be used to try to move the economy back to equilibrium at potential GDP. And monetary policy can be used because monetary policy means central bank intervention in financial markets to influence interest rates in the economy. Interest rates in the economy are an important influence on at least two components of planned aggregate expenditure: firms' planned investment spending and households' consumption spending, though we tend to focus more on the link with planned investment because that does seem to be the most powerful link between interest rates and expenditure. So I'll draw your attention to the planned injections line, and you'll note that next to planned investment I've written 5%. So think about this as what the economy looks like with an interest rate of 5%. We have a contractionary output gap. A monetary policy response to that contractionary output gap would be to take actions, for the central bank to take actions in financial markets to lower the interest rate, thereby encouraging firms to increase their planned investment. Consequently, the planned injections line would shift upwards, and from here the analysis should be very, very familiar. That will lead in the first instance to a disequilibrium in the economy. There will be a fall in inventories. It'll be an unplanned fall in inventories. Firms' response is to boost production. That means an increase in income in the economy. That will lead to increased consumption expenditure. And we get a multiplied increase in GDP as we move to the new equilibrium. What I want to draw your attention to here is the link that this analysis establishes between the monetary policy action and the level of planned aggregate expenditure, and as a consequence, the economy's equilibrium. And that's the link we're going to explore in this new framework, the aggregate demand inflation adjustment model. As I indicated before, we're going to leave the basic Keynesian framework behind because we're going to explore this link between interest rates, expenditure and GDP, but over a time period sufficiently long that price changes become a real possibility. So let me talk a little bit about monetary policy, because as you'll see, monetary policy is absolutely central to the construction of this model and in basically any discussion about inflation. There are two broad ways of thinking about the operation of monetary policy in a macroeconomy. It's often labelled as a situation of rules versus discretion, and you'll hear that phrase a lot in discussions about monetary policy. Rules versus discretion relates to two philosophies, if you like, about how monetary policy can be undertaken in an economy. A rules-based approach is one where the central bank operates almost in a very mechanical way, adjusting the real interest rate. And remember, we drew this distinction between the real and the nominal interest rate, and we established that it's the real interest rate, the difference between the nominal interest rate and the inflation rate, that is the interest rate that influences expenditure decisions. So with a monetary policy rule, the central bank is mechanically adjusting the real interest rate systematically if you like, in a very transparent way, looking at a small set of announced key macroeconomic indicators and making it very clear in advance how the central bank intends to adjust the real interest rate should it observe changes in any or perhaps all of those key macroeconomic indicators. So the point about rules is that it is very much like a very systematic mechanical approach to the setting of interest rates in the economy. It's an approach that everybody understands. It's an approach that's obvious and transparent to all. It's an approach that has the central bank acting almost automatically, if you like, adjusting the real interest rate in line with changes in some key indicators of macroeconomic performance, and everybody in the economy understands what's going on. It doesn't have to be that way, however. Central banks could operate using what is called a discretionary monetary policy. And a discretionary monetary policy, probably the best way to think about it is it's monetary policy where there is no clearly defined, well understood rule behind monetary policy decisions. Instead, the central bank is making what you could think of as judgment calls, adjusting the interest rate in response to a potentially large number of macroeconomic indicators in a way that may not be immediately obvious to everybody else in the economy. Now, I'm not suggesting that a discretionary policy is an irresponsible policy or that there's no logic or rationale behind the monetary policy decisions. What I'm suggesting, however, is that with a discretionary monetary policy, the central bank is not fully revealing the reasons for its decisions, nor is it acting in this mechanistic, automatic way. The central bank is making judgment calls, it's adjusting monetary policy, sometimes this is called, by the seat of their pants, trying to bring about the best macroeconomic outcomes, but not necessarily in an automatic, transparent way that we would see under monetary policy rules. These days, a lot of central banks, perhaps most central banks, think of themselves as following the rules-based approach as opposed to the monetary policy discretion approach. And certainly when you read the literature that many central banks put out, and I would encourage you to go to your own central bank's webpage, and they'll all have statements about their philosophy that they use to undertake their monetary policy. Central banks these days see themselves as following this rules-based approach, seeing merit in being open and transparent, and having monetary policy decisions being relatively predictable or systematic. And we'll actually, in a later lecture, once we fully develop the model, I'll explain a little bit about why central banks see that as an appropriate way in which to operate. But just to signal where we're going, a lot of the rules-based approach to the operation of monetary policy has to do with a concept known as inflation targeting, a concept that came into macroeconomics and indeed into central bank thinking about how to operate monetary policy in the early 1990s. Indeed, the first central bank to sign up to an explicit inflation target was the Reserve Bank of New Zealand. And since that time, increasingly more and more central banks have adopted this concept of inflation targeting. Inflation targeting is very much a rules-based approach. It's usually done through a formal agreement between the central bank and the government that specifies that monetary policy will be directed towards the achievement of a specific target for the inflation rate. Different countries have adopted different inflation targets, but the principle is exactly the same. Everybody understands that monetary policy will be adjusted to try to hit the inflation target. In the New Zealand case, it's around about 2%, and that's a typical figure. Some central banks operate using a range, trying to keep inflation between 2 and 3%, for example. Other central banks adopt a much more specific target. So inflation targeting, and again, once we fully develop the model, I'll show you the intellectual rationale for why this might be a good idea. Inflation targeting is an example of the transparency I've been talking about that underlies a rules-based approach, where everybody understands that the purpose of monetary policy and the way it's going to be conducted is geared towards the achievement of a particular target. I'll ask you to keep that in the back of your mind as we go through this material. I now want to introduce you to one of the most influential concepts in the last 20 years of macroeconomic theory. This is the concept of the policy reaction function, or as it's more commonly known, the Taylor rule. It's called the Taylor rule because the person who first put forward this approach to monetary policy was John Taylor, Professor of Economics at Stanford University, and one of the key figures in the development of the rules-based approach to monetary policy. A policy reaction function in general, or the Taylor rule specifically, which is an example of a policy reaction function, is an attempt to write down in a very concise mathematical way the rule that underlies the setting of monetary policy. Now let me explain what is going on in this equation here, which is the original formulation of the Taylor rule. On the left-hand side, we have the nominal interest rate. And the easiest way to think about this nominal interest rate is that it's the policy interest rate. Central banks typically operate on some key interest rate within their economy and take steps to influence that one interest rate. And for this to work, you've got to pick an interest rate that has close linkages or that influences other interest rates in the economy. And depending on the nature of the financial system, which particular interest rate that is can vary from one country to the next. Again, if you go to your central bank's website, you'll be able to establish which particular interest rate is the policy interest rate for your own economy. So what we have on the left-hand side is the interest rate that is operated on by the central bank in its monetary policy. On the right-hand side, we have the economy's inflation rate. R star here is a concept known as the equilibrium real interest rate. You could think of this, if you like, as being the average real interest rate historically that has been established in this economy. It's usually a figure around 1%, 2% perhaps. Really, all we've written down there is a form of the Fisher equation in some sense, that the nominal interest rate in this economy reflects the inflation rate and some concept of the real interest rate. What's going on in the rest of this equation relates to the macroeconomic variables that the central bank is monitoring, observing, trying to affect through its monetary policy. Let's take this term here, pi t, that's our inflation target. Alpha pi is a number. It's a number that the central bank uses to indicate by how much should the nominal interest rate be changed if the central bank observes a difference between the actual inflation rate and the target inflation rate. So what this part of the expression is saying is that if the central bank sees the actual inflation rate in the economy, for whatever reason, being different from its target, then it will take steps to adjust the nominal interest rate to try to close that gap between what is actually happening to inflation and what is actually, or what is the target inflation rate. Remember, there's a link between interest rates and expenditure in the economy, specifically between interest rates and firms' planned investment expenditure and perhaps household consumption expenditure. For example, take a simple instance. Suppose the actual inflation rate was higher than the target inflation rate because of an exogenous increase in spending in the economy. So there's lots of spending going on in the economy that's pushing up prices. As a consequence, actual inflation moves above its target. In a circumstance like that, the central bank might be trying to increase the real interest rate in order to discourage some of that spending and to try to rein in those price increases. So that's what that part of the expression is saying. Central banks monitor what's happening to inflation very carefully, and if they see a difference between actual inflation and the target for inflation, there will be an interest rate adjustment through monetary policy to try to bring actual inflation back in line with the target. The second term there looks at the output gap, familiar concept to us. And here we're recognising that monetary policy can be used to try to close an output gap. The example that we saw at the very start of this lecture is exactly that. So again, the alpha term, in this case alpha y, is just a number. We'll talk about what value that number might be in a moment, but it's just a number that links any output gap that might be emerging in the economy with the subsequent change in the interest rate brought about by the monetary policy response to that output gap. So it's a simple concept, though it looks a bit daunting when you first see it written down like that, but intuitively what it's saying is that in its setting of monetary policy, central banks are influenced by what is happening to inflation and what is happening to real GDP, and should it see either an output gap or a difference between inflation and target inflation, there will be a monetary policy response. So let's just put some numbers to this. Here, I'm going to use the numbers originally used by John Taylor when he first formulated this way of thinking about monetary policy, where both the alpha terms were given a value of 0.5. So you might wish to see if you can reproduce the figures in this table. So what I've done here is to just assume that the economy's equilibrium real interest rate is 1%. The target inflation rate is 2%. To start the analysis off, let's suppose there's no output gap, so the output gap is 0. And let's suppose the inflation rate is also equivalent to the target. So this would be a very happy situation for a central bank to find itself in. There's actually not much to do here. Inflation's on target, there's no output gap. And so the policy interest rate, the left-hand term, IT, will simply reflect the actual inflation rate and the equilibrium real interest rate. So the policy interest rate here would be 3%. And the actual real interest rate, which I've indicated in the last column in this table, would be equivalent to that equilibrium real interest rate. Point of a policy reaction function, and that's why the word reaction is so important here, is that if circumstances will change, monetary policy will react. So let's suppose an output gap now opens up. It's a positive output gap for this example of 1%. Associated with that positive output gap is going to be some more inflationary pressure in the economy. So we're talking about an economy producing more than its potential GDP. So it's an economy where there's a lot of economic activity going on. It's pushing prices up more rapidly. Inflation increases from 2 to 3%. The equilibrium real interest rate is unchanged, as is the target inflation rate. If you take that information and put it into the Taylor rule equation, you'll find that there will be a monetary policy response, and that response will be to increase the policy interest rate from 3% to 5%. In doing so, if you look at the actual real interest rate, now remember the actual real interest rate is the difference between the nominal interest rate and the inflation rate, you'll see that the monetary policy response here has led to an increase in the actual real interest rate. What the central bank is trying to do here is to close that output gap, to get rid of the expansionary output gap, to take away those inflationary pressures in the economy, moving the inflation rate back to target and moving output back to potential. The means of doing that is by bringing about an increase in the real interest rate in the expectation that that would discourage planned investment and consumption. Let's suppose that it hasn't worked yet, that the output gap widens even more to 2%, there's more inflation. According to the policy reaction function, there will be a further monetary policy response, in this case increasing the policy interest rate to 7%, with an inflation rate of 4%, that means the real interest rate is pushed up even higher to 3%. What the central bank is trying to do here, concerned that this expansionary output gap might be getting out of hand, is to provide a very real level of discouragement to planned investment and consumption. So the central bank is pushing up the real interest rate to try to manage this expansionary output gap and the associated inflationary pressures. I want you to note an important feature of this. What we're doing here, or what the central bank is doing, is pushing up the policy interest rate to bring about an actual real interest rate increase. How is it possible for the central bank to influence the real interest rate? The answer, and you can see it fairly clearly in this data, is each time the inflation rate increases, the corresponding policy interest rate is increased by more. And that's the key to how you operate this Taylor rule monetary policy. You want to bring about changes to the real interest rate. To do that, you've got to adjust the nominal interest rate by more than any change you see in inflation. In doing so, and if you go back to the Fisher equation, you should see this quite clearly, the central bank is able to influence the real interest rate. Another example, which I will just put up without much comment because now it should be fairly self-evident. Here we'll look at a negative output gap and a situation where the rate of inflation is falling, and you'll see here that the policy reaction function would in this case dictate a fall in the policy interest rate and a subsequent fall in the real interest rate. Here you're trying to encourage expenditure in the economy, you're trying to get firms to boost their planned investment, you're trying to get households to boost their consumption spending, you're trying to eliminate the contractionary output gap, in other words. And again, I'll just draw your attention to that link between the nominal policy interest rate and the actual real interest rate. The fact there is a link is because the central bank, following the Taylor rule, is adjusting the nominal interest rate by more than any change to the rate of inflation. So it's a very mechanical approach to monetary policy. It involves monitoring the economy very carefully, inflation and output in particular, and the instant the central bank observes changes to either one or both of those variables, using the Taylor rule to change the interest rate in a very predictable way. The goal of all of this, remember, is to influence the real interest rate, which in turn will influence planned expenditure in the economy. It's often convenient to take the Taylor rule and write it in a slightly different form, and that's this second expression here. The two expressions are actually identical. What I've done here is to use the Fisher equation to note that the actual real interest rate in the economy will equal the nominal interest rate minus the inflation rate. So if I take this part of the Taylor rule and subtract inflation, pi t, from both sides, that enables me to write the real interest rate on the left-hand side. From here on, I'm going to continue to work on the assumption that the equilibrium real interest rate is 1%. That seems to be what it is. I mean, it could be 2%. It doesn't really matter for this analysis. And as before, I'm going to set our alpha terms to be the same as each other, equal to 0.5. That seems a reasonable number, but it doesn't have to be 0.5. It could be some other value, and there's no obvious reason why the two alphas should have the same value either. Different economies may choose different values for those alphas. With all of that structure in place, we get this version of the Taylor rule, the policy reaction function. It just turns out to be a little bit more convenient to work with this version of the Taylor rule, because now we're making it very, very obvious that the objective of monetary policy is to affect the real interest rate, which we now have clearly on the left-hand side of the Taylor rule. Note the following. What this highlights or emphasises for us is a systematic link under this rules-based approach to monetary policy between the real interest rate and inflation. And that is the link that I'm going to focus on as we develop, as we will start to do now, this aggregate demand inflation adjustment model of the macroeconomy. This is not to say that output gaps are unimportant. They are absolutely going to be relevant for our analysis, but in the construction of the model, the key part of the Taylor rule approach to monetary policy will be this link between inflation and the real interest rate. And one thing I should have said, I'm also going to work on the assumption that the target inflation rate is 0. It doesn't have to be that, it just makes the analysis just that little bit easier. Now, why am I highlighting this link between inflation and the real interest rate? Because from here on, I just want to work with diagrams, and if I just focus on those two variables, then I can illustrate the policy reaction function using the following diagram. A positively sloped line where we have the real interest rate on the vertical axis and the economy's actual rate of inflation on the horizontal axis. If you go back to that Taylor rule equation from the previous slide, you'll see how this is just a representation of that equation. It's making the point that the central bank will systematically make adjustments to the real interest rate when it observes changes to the inflation rate. And what the central bank is doing in this instance is that when it sees an increase in inflation, it increases the real interest rate. Should it see a decrease in inflation, it would decrease the real interest rate, and all of that is reflected in this positively sloped policy reaction function. And I'll use the letters PRF as my shorthand for the policy reaction function. So what you're looking at here is a very simple visual representation of a rules-based approach to monetary policy, where we're emphasising the automatic responses that the central bank makes to changes in inflation through its ability to influence the real interest rate. So under what circumstances would we see movement along the policy reaction function? And we're going to be talking a lot about this. Suppose currently the economy had an inflation rate, let's just call it pi 0. That could be a number like 2%, for example. And we would read off the policy reaction function that associated with that interest rate, holding everything else in the economy unchanged, then the policy reaction function would tell the central bank that the appropriate rate of interest is R0. Should, for some reason, now at this stage we don't know what that reason might be, we will come to that as we further develop this model, but let's just suppose, for the sake of illustration, for some reason the economy's inflation rate increases, then with this rules-based approach to monetary policy, the response, the reaction, if you like, will be to increase the real interest rate or take steps to increase the real interest rate, and that's best thought of as a movement along the policy reaction function. Now this point is going to be very, very important for us. We observe a movement along the policy reaction function under one particular circumstance and one circumstance only. It's a circumstance where the central bank uses its monetary policy to adjust the real interest rate because of a change in inflation. Why this is so important is because there will be a variety of circumstances other than changes in inflation that might lead the central bank to change the real interest rate. We'll deal with those very, very shortly, but anything other than a change in the inflation rate that leads to a change in the real interest rate cannot be illustrated by a movement along the policy reaction function. This movement along the PRF only occurs if the interest rate change brought about by the central bank is in response to a change in inflation. Policy reaction functions can also shift. A shift in the policy reaction function would occur under the following more general circumstance. When we speak of a shift in the policy reaction function, what we're dealing with is this. Suppose currently the economy has an inflation rate of pi 0, and from the policy reaction function the central bank has established a real interest rate of R0. Suppose for some reason other than a change in inflation, the central bank decides that a higher real interest rate is appropriate. For example, there might be an expansionary output gap developing, but inflation has not yet adjusted because of that expansionary output gap. So you might be in the early phases of an expansionary output gap. So you're seeing more output, but that's not yet flowed through into higher inflation. But the central bank has spotted what is going on and is determined to take corrective action now before the inflation rate has changed, in which case the central bank increases the real interest rate. What we now have is an interest rate of R1 associated with inflation of pi 0. It was previously R0, it's now R1. What you're looking at, in other words, is that the original policy reaction function is no longer the relevant policy reaction function, there has been a shift in the policy reaction function. So a shift in the policy reaction function occurs any time there is an adjustment to the real interest rate for reasons other than a change in inflation. And let's just make it a little bit more precise, other than a change in current inflation. When we dealt with the movement along the policy reaction function, it was the interest rate being adjusted in response to an observed change in inflation. When we're talking about a shift of the policy reaction function, it's the interest rate being adjusted without there being an observed change in inflation. So let me just give you one example of the policy reaction function in practice. This is a decision taken by the Reserve Bank of Australia in October 2012. Central banks have different ways of communicating their decisions and the thinking behind them to the public. The Reserve Bank of Australia, when it makes a change to the policy interest rate, issues essentially it's a press release which is widely publicised explaining the reasons for its decision. Other central banks do something similar, or they post a notice on their website or hold a press conference or whatever, but central banks usually communicate the reasons for their decision. Now on the 3rd of October 2012, what the Reserve Bank of Australia did was to reduce its policy rate, which is known as the cash rate, to 3.25%. So we're talking about a reduction in the policy interest rate. What I want to highlight for you is the reason. If you have a look at what the Reserve Bank has said here, it says, well, this is not in response to a change in inflation. In fact, the outlook for inflation is consistent with the target over the next 1 to 2 years. So this is not an interest rate adjustment in response to anything, any observed change in inflation. What it was a response to was a softer growth outlook, so concerned that a contractionary output gap might be opening up. So in the context of our policy reaction function, we are very much talking here, in the context of this diagram, a downward shift in the policy reaction function. On that date, what Australia's central bank, the Reserve Bank, did was to lower the interest rate in the economy, not in response to a change in inflation, but because of concern about another factor, in this instance, the opening up of a contractionary output gap. So, as a useful exercise, you might want to visit your own central bank's website and have a look at some recent monetary policy decisions, any changes in the policy interest rate that may have been taken over the last few years. Have a look at the reasons that are given and try to establish whether what you're looking at is a movement along the policy reaction function or a shift. In this case, no change in inflation, but central bank action to reduce the interest rate. Clearly, we're talking about a shift. Well, we covered a great deal of material in the first part of this lecture. It's very important material because the way that monetary policy is operated with a rules-based approach is very important to the way we're going to construct this aggregate demand inflation adjustment or aggregate demand aggregate supply model. So we'll now start to build on the concept of the policy reaction function to show you how this model comes together. So first, let me just quickly remind you what's underlying all of this. And this is the idea that monetary policy influences some important expenditure components, particularly planned investment, and that's what we're going to focus on, which means monetary policy is a possible means of responding to changes in the economy, in this instance, a contractionary output gap. Although, as you've already gathered, a lot of the discussion from here on is going to be focusing on monetary policy as a means of influencing inflation in the economy. Given the move to inflation targeting, it's quite a realistic way of thinking about monetary policy. I want to introduce you to a new concept, though it's not entirely new, the concept of aggregate demand. Now, aggregate demand, and we'll usually abbreviate that to AD, it's a very similar concept to planned aggregate expenditure. In fact, in some ways, actually probably in a very close way, we're really talking about pretty much the same thing. So aggregate demand, the combined planned flow of spending by households, firms, government and foreign sectors. Remember, there we're talking about exports. So why don't we just call it planned aggregate expenditure? It doesn't seem terribly different. The reason is because we're going to develop a concept known as the aggregate demand schedule or aggregate demand curve, and I use those terms interchangeably, which will describe for us a systematic relationship that exists between this concept of aggregate demand and the rate of inflation. And when we discussed planned aggregate expenditure in the context of the basic Keynesian model, inflation was absent from there because we were dealing with a very short time period in which prices don't change. So because we're in a different world now, different framework where the length of time for the analysis has been expanded to allow for the possibility of price change, to allow for the possibility of inflation, economists usually use a different term for planned spending, aggregate demand, just to remind ourselves that this is a similar, but in this important fundamental aspect, different concept to the planned aggregate expenditure used in the basic Keynesian model. Different because we're now focusing on the possibility that changes in inflation can have a systematic impact upon the planned expenditure of the sectors of the economy. Underlying the aggregate demand schedule is indeed the concept of the policy reaction function. Monetary policy and a rules-based approach to monetary policy, the policy reaction function, is one of the key foundation or building blocks of this aggregate demand inflation adjustment model. So this is how it works. On the left-hand side of this slide, we have the policy reaction function, exactly the same as we've seen it before, this systematic rules-based approach to monetary policy where changes in inflation lead to a very predictable monetary policy response through changes in the real interest rate. On the right-hand side, I have two different axes with the economy's rate of inflation on the vertical axis and real GDP on the horizontal axis. It's on the right-hand side that I'm going to construct the economy's aggregate demand schedule, but I want to show it next to the policy reaction function to show you how that underlying this aggregate demand schedule is in fact the policy reaction function. So let's take a point on the policy reaction function. What I mean by that is currently, let's suppose that the economy is experiencing an inflation rate of pi0 and that in response the central bank has established a real interest rate of R0. Now that interest rate of R0 is going to be feeding through and affecting or influencing expenditure plans in the economy, particularly firms, perhaps households. So there will be an associated flow of planned expenditure or aggregate demand associated with that particular interest rate. So on the right-hand set of axes, we can illustrate that as that point there. In other words, what we're saying here is that with the inflation rate of pi 0, exactly the same as we have on the left-hand side, the corresponding real interest rate, which is the result of a systematic rules-based monetary policy, has led to a flow of planned expenditure or aggregate demand in this economy equivalent to Y0. So there is a link between the observation that inflation is pi 0 and that spending plans in the economy are Y0. The link is provided through the policy reaction function. Suppose something changes in this economy. Now, at this point, don't know what that change is, but whatever has happened, it has meant that inflation in the economy has increased. As a consequence, there will be a movement up and along the policy reaction function. The central bank will react to this increase in inflation and will take steps to bring about an increase in the real interest rate. This increase in the real interest rate has implications for planned investment and consumption. And what we would anticipate is that both of those two planned spending flows will decrease in response to the higher real interest rate. Remember, this has been triggered by an increase in the inflation rate. So if we take that information from the left-hand side diagram and translate it into the right-hand side diagram, what has happened here is we have had a higher rate of inflation now associated with a reduction in aggregate demand or planned spending in the economy because of the monetary policy response. So we now have two combinations of inflation and aggregate demand shown on the right-hand side diagram. And if we simply repeat this exercise over and over again and connect up the points, we get the economy's aggregate demand schedule or aggregate demand curve. It's a negative relationship between aggregate demand and inflation that has its basis in the policy reaction function. Now, a lot of times we'll just work with this right-hand side diagram, but I don't want you to ever forget that underlying what's happening in that diagram is this concept of the policy reaction function. If you're ever unsure about what's going on in terms of an aggregate demand schedule or curve, it's often useful just to quickly sketch the corresponding policy reaction function. What you observed in the previous slide was a movement along the policy reaction function and a corresponding movement along the aggregate demand schedule. Shifts of both schedules can also be important. So if we go to the policy reaction function, and we've dealt with this previously, suppose the situation is one where the rate of inflation is unchanged, but for whatever reason, the central bank has judged it appropriate to increase the real interest rate. In other words, to bring about an upward shift in the policy reaction function. How will that translate into the aggregate demand curve? Well, we've had no change in the rate of inflation. And if we indicate that first point on the policy reaction function by lowercase a, we have a corresponding point on the aggregate demand curve. So associated with that inflation rate on the original policy reaction function is a flow of aggregate demand equivalent to Y0. Following the upward shift in the policy reaction function, again, we would expect to observe falls in planned investment and falls in consumption. So we would expect there to be less aggregate demand. In this case, there is less aggregate demand even though there has been no change in the rate of inflation. Consequently, we're dealing with a point like, let's call it B, which corresponds to point B on the new policy reaction function. What you're observing, in other words, is the same rate of inflation, but with a reduction in the flow of aggregate demand. In other words, the aggregate demand curve has shifted to the left. So you start to see here the close link between the policy reaction function and the aggregate demand curve. If you observe a movement along the policy reaction function, you'll be observing a movement along the aggregate demand curve. If you observe a shift in the policy reaction function, what you'll be observing is a shift in the aggregate demand schedule. It's important, however, to understand that the aggregate demand curve can shift for reasons entirely unrelated to the policy reaction function. Shifts in the policy reaction function represent one reason why the aggregate demand curve might itself shift, but they're not the only reason. For example, you might have an exogenous decrease in planned expenditure, exactly as we talked about at length in our discussion of the basic Keynesian model. Firms may be feeling more pessimistic about the future, therefore they cut back on their planned investment expenditure. Government expenditure might be falling, demand for exports might be falling. All sorts of things could be going on that are unrelated to the policy reaction function. So in this circumstance, what you have, if we go to the policy reaction function, is actually no change. Nothing has yet happened to the inflation rate. There's been no shift in the policy reaction function. There's been no movement along the policy reaction function. So as far as the policy reaction function is concerned, it will remain as is, and the combination of interest rate and inflation will remain at A. Nonetheless, we've had this exogenous decrease in planned expenditure, so that whilst initially we had inflation of pi0 being associated with y0, after the exogenous decrease in planned expenditure, we will have a different combination of inflation and aggregate demand. There's less aggregate demand. We've had a reduction in planned expenditure. In other words, what we've seen is a leftward shift in the aggregate demand curve. This is an important concept. It's important to understand that shifts in the aggregate demand curve can be brought about because of deliberate actions taken by the central bank. In other words, a shift in the central bank's policy reaction function. But there are a host of other factors that can shift the aggregate demand curve, and they're similar in nature to the sorts of factors we talked about in our discussion of the basic Keynesian model, exogenous changes in planned expenditure. What we're in the process of doing is constructing what is called the aggregate demand inflation adjustment, or as it's sometimes known, the aggregate demand aggregate supply model. So far we've spent a lot of our time talking about the role of monetary policy and the use of a rules-based monetary policy approach, and how we can take that approach and from it derive the concept of aggregate demand. The fact that a rules-based monetary policy, following the Taylor rule principle, will imply a negative relationship between inflation and aggregate demand. So that's the end of the aggregate demand side of the model. That means we're about 3/4 of the way towards completing the model. But to complete the model, we need to say something a little bit about the supply side of the economy. And the supply side of the economy is going to be introduced into the model using the concept of inflation adjustment. So this is the IA part of the model. We're going to take a particular view about how inflation evolves or changes in the economy. It's summarised by the equation in front of you, which may look a little bit bewildering when you first see it, and that's understandable because there's actually a lot going on here. So what I want to do is break this down for you so you can see exactly what it is we're saying about inflation adjustment, exactly what it is we're saying about the circumstances in which the economy's inflation rate changes, and how this relates to firms' willingness to supply output to the economy, because that ultimately is what we're doing in this part of the model, talking about firms' supply behaviour in the macroeconomy. Let me first focus on the first part of the equation. Pi t is the rate of inflation in the economy in the current period. Pi t minus 1 is the rate of inflation in the immediate past period. Just ignore the rest of the equation for the moment. I want to focus on this first part. What you're looking at in that part of the equation is something that macroeconomists refer to as inflation inertia. Inflation inertia is the idea that under normal circumstances there's a very close link between the rate of inflation that we observe in this period and the most recent experience we've had of inflation, that is the rate of inflation that has been experienced in the past period. The use of the word inertia is quite deliberate here. Inertia suggests that there's not much change going on, and that indeed is exactly what that part of the equation says. That part of the equation says, ignoring the rest of the equation, that what you observe for this period's inflation is going to be exactly the same as what you observed in the previous period's inflation. Now there is an important rationale for that, which we'll now describe. The rationale has to do with the role of expectations and the role that expectations play in price setting. And what I'd ask you to do is think about yourself as the manager of a small firm trying to establish the pricing policy for your product over the coming 12 months. One of the things you're going to be thinking about is what will happen to your costs over the coming 12 months. For example, you may have some information to suggest that your costs are likely to increase by 5% over the coming year. Now, you're the manager of a firm, you're concerned about your profit margin. If you genuinely think that there's going to be a 5% increase in costs over the next 12 months, then it would make sense for you to plan to raise your prices by 5% in order to protect your profit margin. Indeed, your shareholders, for example, if you're a publicly listed company, would expect exactly this: preserve the profit margin. The question then is, well, where do you get your information from? How do you know that costs are going to increase by 5% over the next year? There's been lots of work done on this exact question using surveys, for example, asking business people Well, what sort of information do you use when you try to decide on your pricing strategy? And it turns out that in thinking about how likely it is that there will be cost increases over the coming 12 months, the factor that looms largest in that calculation is what's been the most recent experience of cost increase, or what's been the most recent inflation experience that you've observed. So firm, for example, may have seen its costs increase by 5% last year. That acts as what is known as an anchor for expectations. In other words, people seem to have this tendency that if they have seen their costs increase by 5% last year, they accept, well, that's probably normal now. So it's most likely that costs are going to increase by 5% again this year. So you can see what's happening here. What's happening here is the expectations are going to reflect the most recent inflation experience. Those expectations are going to be very important in determining the forthcoming inflation experience. If those expectations are based on the immediate past observation of inflation, that's going to get built in to pricing decisions and hence actual inflation over the coming period. The result is this inflation inertia, a tendency for this period's inflation to be very similar to last period's inflation. You can actually see it in the data. What I've done in this chart is to collect data for the United States on CPI inflation, on the inflation rate as measured by the Consumer Price Index. And then I've plotted that data, but I've plotted it in a very particular way. I've plotted it by having the current period's inflation rate measured along the vertical axis and the inflation rate in the immediate preceding period on the horizontal axis. And as you'd expect, you get what's called a scatter diagram. But you can see that if I was to put a trend line through that diagram, and that's what the black line is, that's pretty close to a 45-degree line. It's pretty close to a line that says the inflation we're observing this period is going to be very similar, indeed, on average, identical to the inflation we've observed in the last period. Let's see if it works. If the inflation rate was around about 6% in the last period, then the trend line tells us it's going to be around 6% in the current period. So this inflation inertia, on average, does seem to characterise the actual behaviour of inflation in the United States. It's not an exact relationship. You'll see that there are many observations that don't lie exactly on the trend line. The real world is rarely as neat and tidy as our economic theories might like to suggest. The way to look at this is that there's a tendency, all else being unchanged, for on average inflation inertia to characterise actual inflation. What this means is that if we were ever to write down a model of how inflation behaves in the macroeconomy, we have to take this concept seriously, and this has to be an important part of that model. So that's why in our inflation adjustment equation we have a very explicit recognition of the existence of inflation inertia. What about the rest of the equation? The next term, it's probably best to think of this as an assumption, though it is an assumption that does seem to be borne out in practice. And the assumption is that output gaps lead to changes in inflation. Now, the term gamma, that's the Greek letter gamma, is just a number, and it'll be different for different economies. What's important, though, is that it's a positive number. What this suggests is that when an economy experiences a positive output gap, when actual GDP is above potential, what that does is to cause inflation to increase. And when the economy has a negative output gap, when the economy is having a contractionary output gap and actual GDP is below potential, that has the effect of pushing inflation down. Intuitively, it makes sense. An expansionary output gap where output is above potential, there's lots and lots of economic activity going on there. There's lots of demand for productive resources. Factories are working 24 hours, 7 days a week, for example. That's going to push up costs. That's going to lead to inflationary pressure. When there's a recession, when the economy is in a contractionary output gap, firms are finding it very difficult to sell their output. They're going to slow the rate of price increase right down to try to encourage people to buy their product. We would see a corresponding fall in the inflation rate. So as well as inflation inertia, here in this term we're recognising the reality that output gaps lead to changes in inflation. What about that third term? That's the Greek letter epsilon. Think of that as just a random term. Think of that as a term that's just capturing anything else that might possibly affect the rate of inflation. It could be climate, for example. There might be a lack of rainfall, an unexpected lack of rainfall, which leads to harvests failing, for example, pushing up food prices. So just random unexpected events that can also have an impact upon inflation. They exist, we need to take account of them in our inflation adjustment equation, though economic theory isn't going to provide us terribly much insight into those random events because they're unexpected. It's very hard to predict when the harvest is going to fail, for example, so we refer to that as a random term. And to keep life simple, for the most part, we're just going to set that equal to 0, so we're going to ignore that possibility. Sometimes we might talk a little bit about what are called inflation shocks, where that term comes into play, but unless I use that expression, then just think of epsilon as not being relevant for the discussion. So we have here a pretty sophisticated model of inflation adjustment capturing two key elements of inflation behaviour in the real world: the tendency for there to be inflation inertia, which remember is grounded in the importance of expectations, and also the reality that output gaps can have implications for changes in inflation. Let's explore this inflation adjustment concept a little more deeply. It has some actually really important and surprising implications for the way inflation behaves in real-world economies. So I've just put an example of an inflation adjustment equation on the top right-hand side of the screen. I've just set gamma equal to 0.75 for this exercise, but you might want to repeat this exercise using other values of gamma. As long as it's a positive number, it doesn't really matter that much for the analysis. And I just want to go through an example of tracking an economy through a sequence of events over time, so you can see how this inflation adjustment concept works. And then we're going to take that information and transfer it into the diagram at the bottom of the slide, having inflation on one axis and output on the other. So we'll start off with a nice simple situation which we'll assume has lasted for 2 periods now. There's no output gap. Inflation is 1%, and we're going to keep track of what inflation is in the current period, but also what inflation was in the last period. And that's going to be important because we want to keep an eye on what's happening to inflation inertia. So not a terribly exciting economy in one sense. Everything's pretty quiet. There's no change in inflation. There's no output gap. This is an economy that's just travelling through these two periods and doing quite well. But let's suppose let's illustrate that concept before we change things. So what you're looking at here is known as the IA line. It shows a couple of things. First of all, it shows that the current inflation rate is 1%. But I'd ask you to note that it's drawn as a horizontal line in this diagram. Now that's important because it reflects an important underlying behavioural assumption we're now going to bring into the analysis. And the assumption is this. It's an assumption about firms' willingness to supply output. And it's an assumption that says that given the inflation rate of 1%, firms will supply whatever the market demands. And so this horizontal line, which I like to call the inflation adjustment line, is also sometimes referred to as the economy's short-run aggregate supply line. And that's referring to that assumption there. In other words, no matter what the level of demand is, as long as firms think the inflation rate is going to be 1%, they'll supply. If demand is low, they'll supply that low demand. If demand is high, they'll supply that high demand. Remember that underlying this inflation adjustment concept is expectations. Firms are not surprised by this inflation rate of 1% and they're prepared to adjust their production to whatever the demand is given the existence of that 1% inflation. So I'll use those terms interchangeably, the inflation adjustment schedule or the short-run aggregate supply schedule. They mean exactly the same thing. They're grounded in this inflation adjustment line, but there's also this assumption in the background here, a very important assumption about firms' willingness to supply output. Go back to the table. Suppose something changes. Suppose an expansionary output gap now emerges. So there is a positive gap between actual GDP and potential GDP. According to our inflation adjustment equation, the opening up of a positive output gap will immediately feed through into an increase in inflation. And we observe that there. Inflation has increased from 1% to 1.75%. Inflation last period, well, we're carrying that over from the past, that's still 1%. So we've had an increase in inflation that has come through the opening up of a positive output gap. In terms of the diagram, we would illustrate that with an upward shift of the IA schedule, reflecting the fact that we now are operating with an inflation rate of 1.75%. But that is not the end of the story. It's not the end of the story because of expectations and what all of this implies for expectations regarding inflation. Because what happens next is the following. That higher inflation rate now gets built in to expectations. So when we move to period 4, we now recognise that inflation in the previous period is no longer 1%, but is now 1.75%. That gets built into expectations. We've still got the 1% expansionary output gap, so we're still getting pressure from there to increase prices. But now we have the added impetus for price increases coming through the expectations term, coming through that inflation inertia. So the combination of that change to expectations and the continuation of the positive output gap means inflation increases yet further to 2.5%, and we illustrate that with another upward shift in the inflation adjustment schedule. Let's continue. Let's suppose the output gap, for whatever reason, now disappears. Does that mean we go back to our starting point? And the answer is no. And the answer is no because of inflation inertia. That higher inflation rate that we observed in period 4 now gets built into expectations. Even though the output gap has dissipated, the output gap is now gone, the expectations are still there. Remember, we're working on the basis of a model where if you've seen 2.5% inflation in the past, you expect that to continue in the future. So that higher expectation gets built in, and consequently, with the removal of the output gap, the inflation adjustment line doesn't drop back down, but it stays at the level of that new higher inertial rate of inflation. That's a really interesting implication of this model. The output gap has only lasted for a few periods, but because it affects expected inflation, and because expected inflation continues to feed into actual inflation, the temporary output gap has led to a permanent increase in inflation. And that's a theme we're going to come back to again and again. All right, there's a lot going on here, and you will need to almost certainly sit down and think about this at some depth, because it's quite a sophisticated model of inflation adjustment. Go back to the equation if you ever get lost here, and remember that the equation has two components, one component recognising inflation inertia, the other component recognising the role played by output gaps. And if you just follow the logic of that equation through, you can start to see why we get these shifts in the IA line and what that actually represents. And as an exercise, I would ask you to use the same example, in other words, use the same inflation adjustment equation, and just check that if we went in the other direction, if we introduced a temporary contractionary output gap, that you'll actually see a permanent fall in inflation holding everything else constant. And make sure you understand the important role that's being played by expectations when you go through that exercise. One last thing to say about inflation adjustment, and indeed about the way we're thinking about the supply side of this economy. I want to introduce you to a concept known as the long-run aggregate supply schedule. So that's what I've illustrated here. The long-run aggregate supply schedule. It reflects something we've spoken about before, and that's the exogenous nature of the economy's potential GDP. Exogenous in the context of this model. We know what sorts of factors influence potential GDP because we explored them at length in our material on growth economics, but that's outside this model. The economy's potential GDP will be at a particular flow, let's call it Y star. It's exogenous to this model. We'll think about it as being the economy's aggregate supply that we would observe in the long run, if you like, in the absence of any business cycle. Because it's exogenous, it is unaffected by what is happening to inflation, by assumption, by construction, if you like. And therefore, the economy's long-run aggregate supply schedule is drawn as a vertical line in this diagram. No matter what the rate of inflation, be it high, be it low, be it somewhere in the middle, all of that is completely irrelevant for the economy's potential GDP. It's exogenous. And to illustrate that exogenous nature of potential GDP, we draw long-run aggregate supply as a vertical line, which simply reflects it doesn't matter what's happening to inflation, the economy's potential flow of GDP is given from outside of the model. That's important because we now have a very complete picture of inflation adjustment in the economy. Remember, inflation adjustment has two components. The inertia that exists in inflation, which is captured by the horizontal inflation adjustment line. Remember, underlying that is an assumption about firms' willingness to supply whatever output is demanded given the prevailing rate of inflation. And we also are able to illustrate the economy's long-run aggregate supply, this exogenously given potential GDP, which is important because the second factor that influences inflation is the output gap. So let's suppose we start off in a situation where the economy's actual GDP corresponds to potential GDP. There is no output gap, in other words. Under such circumstances, nothing would change in this diagram. There's nothing leading to a shift either upward or downward in the IA line. And of course, the long-run aggregate supply curve is not going to change because there's been no exogenous change in the economy's potential GDP. Contrast that with a situation where there is an output gap. Let's suppose a positive output gap where actual GDP is higher than potential GDP. On the diagram, therefore, we're talking about points to the right of potential GDP. We've seen what happens under these circumstances. Under these circumstances, the economy's inflation adjustment line, or its short-run aggregate supply line, will shift up. And I'd ask you to go back to that numerical exercise we went through the table where we showed that whenever actual output is above potential GDP, then inflation continues to increase. So anytime we observe actual output to the right of Y star in this diagram, the diagram will not remain unchanged. What you will see is that IA schedule, the short-run aggregate supply schedule, shifting up and up and up. In other words, as long as there is a positive output gap in the economy, expect to see ever-increasing rates of inflation. Expect to see, in other words, the inflation adjustment line continuously shifting upwards. It follows from the logic of the model. It follows from the way this model is put together. If we're in the other segment of the diagram where there is a contractionary output gap and actual GDP is below potential GDP, so we're to the left of Y star, well, it just works in the opposite direction. The inflation adjustment line will shift down and will continue to shift down as long as actual output is to the left of Y star. So this concept of inflation adjustment, there's a lot going on here. I'd ask you to review this material and make sure you really understand what we mean by inflation inertia, understand the significance of that assumption that firms will supply whatever is demanded at the prevailing rate of inflation, Make sure you understand the important role of expectations in driving that inflation inertia, and make sure that you understand why it is, in the context of that inflation adjustment equation, why it is that whenever you see an output gap, as long as that output gap is in existence, that means that the rate of inflation will be continuously changing. What we're going to do in this lecture is bring together all the material that we've been talking about relating to monetary policy, policy reaction function, inflation adjustment, inflation inertia, long-run aggregate supply, and construct the complete aggregate demand inflation adjustment or aggregate demand and aggregate supply model. And then we'll see how that model can be used to shed light on some important real-world issues. So first, let me introduce you to the concept of short-run equilibrium as it applies to this particular model. And this goes back to our assumption about firms' willingness to supply any amount of output that corresponds to the prevailing flow of demand given the current rate of inflation. So remember, that assumption is summarised in the horizontal slope of the IA line. We're going to define a situation of short-run equilibrium then to be the following: the point at which the aggregate demand schedule crosses the IA line. What is happening there is that given a particular rate of inflation, in this case pi 0, there's been a monetary policy response determined by the policy reaction function that has influenced the flow of aggregate demand in this economy so that that flow of aggregate demand is y0. Given our assumption of how firms behave, then firms will supply this demand. So there's no imbalance between supply and demand in the short run, given the way that we've constructed this model. And so that this point represents a point of genuine equilibrium. But for reasons that will become obvious shortly, this is an equilibrium that's best thought of as holding in the short run. So short run equilibrium corresponds to the point at which the aggregate demand schedule crosses the IA line, remembering the important assumption that firms are going to supply whatever is demanded. Now that short run equilibrium can change. So let's take the following scenario. We have a short run equilibrium established at A. It can change if, for example, there is a shift in aggregate demand. Suppose there's an exogenous increase in aggregate demand, for example, something we talked about in our previous lecture, so that the aggregate demand curve shifts to the right. In other words, an increase in aggregate demand without there having to have been any change in inflation. Short-run equilibrium will now be represented by point B. The economy's short-run equilibrium flow of GDP will be Y prime, and we're assuming that what firms do in the short run is to adjust their production in line with the change in demand. So firms are essentially moving along this IA line. Remember, this can also be thought of as a short run aggregate supply line, which is probably a useful way to think about it when we're focusing on firms' supply response to this sort of shift in aggregate demand. So now let's bring everything together. And I'm going to introduce a concept known as the economy's long-run equilibrium, which is a different concept to short-run equilibrium. So now we're going to combine all elements of our analysis. We have our horizontal inflation adjustment or short-run aggregate supply line. We have our vertical long-run aggregate supply line. Remember that potential GDP, Y star in this model, is exogenous. It's determined by factors outside of the model. It is not affected in any systematic way by changes to inflation, and hence the economy's long-run aggregate supply line is drawn vertically, extending upwards from the point of potential GDP. And now let's introduce aggregate demand, and let's draw the diagram so that aggregate demand passes through the intersection of the inflation adjustment line and long-run aggregate supply. And let me label that point A. Now point A clearly satisfies our definition for a short-run equilibrium. But I'm also going to claim that point A makes sense if we think about a concept of long-run equilibrium. Now here I really want to emphasize the idea that an equilibrium means that the system is at rest. We saw in our previous lecture that any output gap, either positive or negative, has the effect of shifting the inflation adjustment line. And it's because of the way we've constructed inflation adjustment. Which means, should output for any reason be either to the right of Y star or to the left of Y star, in other words, should for any reason there be an output gap, this system would not be at rest. It would not be at rest because the inflation adjustment line would be moving. The one unique point at which there is long-run equilibrium, at which there is the system, the economy being at rest, must therefore be point A. Because what is happening at point A? At point A, we have the existence of an inflation rate, which leads to a monetary policy response, which is giving a flow of aggregate demand that corresponds with the economy's potential GDP. There's no output gap. Firms are supplying that amount of output. They're doing that both because of our short-run assumption that firms will always supply what's demanded, but also because you can think of this as the long-run potential. This is what firms would ordinarily be supplying in aggregate. And so the economy is quite literally at rest. Unless something should change, there is no reason why this economy wouldn't stay at point A, heading off into the indefinite future. So this concept of long-run equilibrium is going to be a very important one for us, because if the economy were to be in long-run equilibrium, then it would be an economy at rest or in equilibrium. Now, we've not yet established the economy will be in long-run equilibrium. All we've done here, let me stress, is identify what long-run equilibrium must look like. But we'll come back to that question of whether the economy is in long-run equilibrium shortly. So I've introduced you to a lot of information and a lot of concepts. In some ways, this is a simple model. We don't need too many lines to actually illustrate what's going on, but there's a lot of structure to this model, a lot of things going on behind the scenes. So I just want to pause for a moment and highlight what are the key features that underlie the construction of the model, and then we'll start to explore the properties of the model and how it can be used to illustrate some important real-world economic occurrences. So what are some of the key concepts we've dealt with so far? This idea of inflation and inflation inertia is terribly important. As long as there's no output gap, this period's inflation will reflect last period's inflation rate, and the key concept there is inflation expectations and our assumption that inflation expectations are anchored by the most recent experience of inflation, and that very much is what underlies the concept of inflation inertia. Really important that you understand exactly the implications and what's going on in that particular aspect of the model. Inertia, however, can be overcome, or to put it perhaps a little bit more plainly, the inflation rate changes if there's an output gap. And that has a very, very important implication. Because any change in inflation gets built into expectations, temporary output gaps can lead to permanent changes in inflation. And that's going to be a very important feature of the model when we start applying it to some real-world circumstances. So output gaps don't have to last terribly long, but they can nonetheless have very long standing effects upon what is happening to inflation, because changes to inflation get built into expectations. Once it's built into expectations, inflation inertia takes charge, and that means inflation can be something that is quite difficult to change in some sense. If there's an expansionary output gap and inflation increases, you might end up with higher inflation for a very, very long time because it's built into expectations. The concept of long-run aggregate supply is important for us. Within the context of the model, we can't say anything about the factors that determine that long-run aggregate supply. They're exogenous. They may change. In fact, we're going to deal with a case study where that does happen. But within the model, we have a means through the long-run aggregate supply curve to illustrate what the economy's potential flow of GDP actually is. We have this important assumption not about the long-run supply but short-run supply, that in the short run firms are prepared to supply whatever is demanded, and we know that that's reflected in the horizontal nature of the inflation adjustment line. And then we have this concept of short-run equilibrium, which reflects that assumption about firms' willingness to supply what's demanded, and we're going to refer to any circumstance where the aggregate demand schedule intersects the inflation adjustment line as being short-run equilibrium. Long-run equilibrium is a bit more specific. There's one unique point of long-run equilibrium, and that's where, given the prevailing or current rate of inflation, the monetary policy response to that inflation results in a flow of aggregate demand that corresponds exactly to potential GDP. Underlying a lot of this is our view of monetary policy being based on a rule, in this instance the Taylor rule. And the Taylor rule is a very systematic, mechanical way of thinking about monetary policy, the interest rate being adjusted in response to inflation and the output gap. And that's important because the whole concept of aggregate demand and its negative slope, negative relationship, in other words, between inflation and aggregate demand is very much built on this policy reaction function, on this Taylor rule. And finally, remember, because this is going to be important for us, this distinction between movements along the aggregate demand schedule and shifts of the aggregate demand schedule. And those shifts may be because of something happening to the policy reaction function, a shift in the policy reaction function, but they need not be caused by that. There could be exogenous factors at work leading to shifts in aggregate demand. All right, let's return to the analysis now and ask a key question. And that's whether this long-run equilibrium is where we'd expect the economy to be. Is there any tendency, in other words, for the economy to actually be at its long-run equilibrium? The economy is away from long-run equilibrium. Are there forces at work pushing it back there? And the answer, I'll give you the answer straight away, is yes, not surprisingly. And it relates to an important concept in the context of this model known as self-correction. And it's really, when I use that term self-correction, I'm really talking about, I guess, the logical implications of how we've put the model together. As a matter of logic, as you'll see, should the economy find itself away from long-run equilibrium, there will be a process that automatically kicks in that will take the economy back to long-run equilibrium. It might take time. It might take time. This model relates to longer periods of time than the basic Keynesian model. There's no necessity for anything I'm going to describe to happen quickly. But the main point here is that there is self-correction in the economy. The economy will adjust in automatic ways to return to long-run equilibrium.